The morning began with silence, not the ordinary quiet of a palace preparing for another day of ceremonial routine, but the deliberate, suffocating silence of an institution holding its breath. By 7 o'clock, senior members of the royal household had received identical messages through encrypted channels. All external communications were suspended. All scheduled appointments were canceled. All staff members below a certain security clearance were asked to remain in designated areas until further notice. No explanation was offered, none was needed. Everyone who had served the crown long enough understood that when the palace sealed itself, something fundamental was about to change. King Charles had been awake since before dawn, standing alone in his private study while London stirred to life beyond the windows. On the mahogany desk before him lay a document that had taken months of constitutional consultation to prepare. Legal experts had been sworn to secrecy. Historical precedents had been researched in archives that few people knew existed. Parliamentary liaisons had been quietly briefed on theoretical scenarios without being told which scenario was about to become reality. The document represented the most significant constitutional innovation in the monarchy's modern history, and it concerned Camilla. At precisely 9 o'clock, the senior members of the royal family were summoned to the blue drawing room. No advance briefing had been provided. No agenda had been circulated. Prince William arrived first, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes alert to every detail. The arrangement of chairs had been altered from its usual configuration. Additional security personnel stood at positions they normally never occupied. The constitutional secretary waited beside a table laden with sealed folders rather than the usual informal papers. Princess Catherine entered moments later, her composure absolute but her awareness heightened by the unusual atmosphere. She had learned to read the palace's moods through subtle signals, minus the positioning of staff, the quality of silence in corridors, the particular tension that preceded institutional announcements. This morning, every signal indicated something unprecedented. Princess Anne followed, her expression revealing nothing but her posture, carrying the weight of someone who suspected she knew what was coming. She had spent weeks in private consultation with constitutional experts. She had reviewed historical documents that hadn't been examined in decades. She had participated in theoretical discussions about scenarios that seemed too extraordinary to ever require implementation. Prince Edward completed the gathering, taking his seat with the quiet resignation of someone who had long ago accepted that royal life regularly demanded the impossible. When Charles entered, he carried himself with the particular gravity reserved for moments when the crown must act beyond the comfortable boundaries of precedent. He did not offer the usual family pleasantries. He did not attempt to soften what was coming with familiar conversation. He simply took his position at the head of the table and began. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of absolute decision. He announced that he had spent considerable time reviewing the constitutional framework that governed the role of Queen Consort. He had consulted with the most senior legal authorities available to the crown. He had examined every precedent, every historical example, every theoretical possibility within the existing structure of the monarchy, and he had concluded that the existing framework was insufficient. The room absorbed this statement in complete silence. William's hands remained perfectly still on the table. Catherine's expression did not change. Anne continued to watch her brother with the steady attention of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. Charles reached for the document on the table. He explained that the role of Queen Consort, as traditionally understood, existed entirely at the discretion of the reigning monarch. It carried no independent constitutional weight. It provided no protection against future alteration or diminishment. It offered no guarantee of continuity beyond the life of the sovereign who granted it. This arrangement, he continued, was no longer acceptable. The implications began to settle over the room like a slow-moving storm. William felt something cold move through his chest as he began to understand the direction his father was taking. Catherine's breathing became deliberately controlled as she calculated the constitutional ramifications. Anne's eyes narrowed slightly as theoretical discussions suddenly became concrete reality. Charles lifted the document. With absolute clarity, he announced that he was creating an entirely new constitutional position. Effective immediately, Camilla would no longer hold the traditional role of Queen Consort. Instead, she would become the first person in British history to hold the title of Queen Regnant Consort, minus a position that granted her independent constitutional status. Separate from her marriage to the king, with powers and protections that could not be altered by future monarchs without parliamentary approval, the silence that followed was not mere surprise. It was the sound of constitutional reality shifting beneath everyone's feet. William found his voice first, though it emerged more quietly than he had intended. He asked what precisely this new title would entail. The question carried layers of meaning that everyone present understood. He was not asking for ceremonial details. He was asking about power, about authority, about the future of the succession itself. Charles answered with the precision of someone who had anticipated every possible question. The Queen Regnant Consort would hold independent constitutional authority over certain aspects of royal governance. She would have the right to independent counsel, independent household management, and independent ceremonial status. Most significantly, her position would be protected by statute, meaning it could not be diminished or abolished by future monarchs acting alone. Catherine absorbed this information with growing alarm. The constitutional innovation was breathtaking in its scope. Charles was not simply protecting his wife from future marginalization. He was fundamentally altering the balance of power within the monarchy itself, creating a dual authority structure that had no historical precedent. Princess Anne asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. She inquired whether this decision had been made in consultation with Parliament, given its obvious constitutional implications. Charles's answer was both legally precise and politically explosive. The creation of the title fell within his prerogative as sovereign. Parliamentary approval was not required for its establishment, only for its future alteration. He had, in effect, used the Crown's constitutional authority to create a position that the Crown alone could not later eliminate. The meeting continued for another hour as the practical implications were discussed. The legal framework was explained. The ceremonial adjustments were outlined. The public announcement strategy was reviewed. But beneath all the procedural details, everyone present understood the fundamental reality of what had occurred. Charles had not simply made a decision about titles and ceremonies. He had rewritten the constitutional structure of the monarchy to ensure that his wife's position would survive his own death with unprecedented security. When the family meeting concluded and the others had departed, William remained behind. He looked at his father across the now empty table and asked the question that had been building throughout the morning. Why had Charles felt this extraordinary step was necessary? The king's answer revealed the personal vulnerability beneath the constitutional innovation. He explained that he had watched previous queen consorts become marginalized after their husbands' deaths. He had observed how institutional loyalty shifted toward new monarchs, leaving widowed consorts increasingly isolated. He had seen how the establishment's acceptance of controversial figures often proved temporary, dependent on the protection of the reigning sovereign. Charles looked directly at his son and spoke with painful honesty. He said he could not guarantee that William would feel the same obligation to protect Camilla that he himself felt. He could not assume that future courtiers would extend the same respect to her that his own household provided. He could not trust that the institution would remember her service once his own authority was no longer there to enforce that memory. By creating the Queen Regnant Consort position, Charles was building constitutional protection that would outlast his own life and extend beyond William's personal feelings about his stepmother. William absorbed this explanation in silence. He understood, with crystalline clarity, that his father had just made the most significant decision of his reign, not because of its immediate impact, but because of its permanent implications for every future monarch. The announcement reached the public at noon precisely. The statement was released simultaneously through every official channel, accompanied by detailed constitutional briefings that had been prepared over months of secret consultation. The language was formal, precise, and historically unprecedented. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Constitutional experts found themselves discussing theoretical scenarios they had never expected to see implemented. Political commentators struggled to analyze the implications of a decision that had no historical parallel. Legal scholars debated the precedent-setting nature of using royal prerogative to create permanent constitutional change. Public opinion fractured along predictable lines. Some viewed the decision as a romantic gesture of unprecedented devotion. a king using his ultimate authority to protect the woman he loved. Others saw it as a dangerous constitutional innovation that concentrated too much power in unelected hands. Still, others questioned whether the monarchy had the right to alter its own structure so fundamentally without broader democratic consultation. International reaction was equally intense. Constitutional monarchies across Europe watched with fascination and concern as Britain's crown demonstrated its capacity for radical self-transformation. Republican movements seized on the decision as evidence of monarchy's inherent problems with accountability and democratic oversight. Inside the palace, Camilla received the news in her private sitting room. She had known it was coming. Minus Charles had discussed the possibility with her for months, but knowing something intellectually and experiencing its reality were entirely different things. She looked at the official document that confirmed her new status and felt a complex mixture of gratitude, responsibility, and profound unease. Charles had given her something unprecedented: constitutional independence within the monarchy itself. She would never again be vulnerable to the shifting loyalties of courtiers or the personal preferences of future sovereigns. But she also understood the price of this protection. Every decision she made from this point forward would be scrutinized as the actions of someone wielding independent constitutional authority. Every public appearance would be analyzed for evidence of how she was using her new powers. Every interaction with other members of the royal family would be examined for signs of tension or competition. Charles had protected her from future marginalization, but he had also placed her in a position where she could never again simply be a supportive spouse standing quietly beside the throne. That evening, after the initial media storm had reached its peak and the palace communications team had fielded hundreds of inquiries, Charles and Camilla sat together in their private apartments. The formal announcements had been made. The constitutional machinery had been set in motion. The decision was now part of history. Camilla looked at her husband and asked the question that had been growing throughout the day. She asked whether he truly believed this extraordinary step had been necessary, or whether fear of the future had driven him to create solutions for problems that might never have materialized. Charles considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He told her that he could not know with certainty what challenges the future would bring. He could not predict how institutional loyalties would shift after his death. He could not guarantee that his successors would feel bound by informal promises or traditional courtesies, but he could create constitutional facts that would outlast uncertainty. He could build legal protections that would survive changing personal relationships. He could ensure that her position within the monarchy was determined by statute rather than sentiment. Camilla absorbed this answer quietly. She understood that Charles had acted from love, but also from a king's responsibility to think beyond his own lifetime. He had used his constitutional authority not just to protect her, but to establish a precedent that would influence how the monarchy treated its most vulnerable members for generations to come. She reached for his hand and told him that she understood both the gift and the burden he had given her. She promised that she would use her new constitutional independence responsibly, always remembering that she held it not just for herself, but as a trust for future consorts who might find themselves in similar positions of vulnerability. Charles squeezed her hand gently. Outside their window, London continued its evening routine, largely unaware that the constitutional structure governing their nation had been fundamentally altered that day. Inside the palace, the machinery of monarchy adjusted to accommodate its new dual authority structure. The decision would have consequences that neither Charles nor Camilla could fully foresee. Future monarchs would inherit a crown whose powers had been both exercised and constrained in unprecedented ways. The relationship between sovereign and consort had been permanently redefined. The monarchy had demonstrated its capacity for radical self-transformation while simultaneously limiting its own future flexibility. But in that quiet evening moment, surrounded by the weight of history and the uncertainty of the future, two people who had survived decades of public scrutiny and institutional pressure sat together in the knowledge that they had found a way to protect what mattered most to them. The crown had evolved. The Constitution had expanded, and love expressed through the careful application of royal prerogative had created something entirely new in the long history of the British monarchy. The announcement that stunned the world would be debated by constitutional scholars for decades to come. But for Charles and Camilla, sitting together as the first king and queen regnant consort in British history, it represented something simpler and more profound. The moment when duty and devotion discovered they could, with sufficient creativity and constitutional courage, find a way to coexist,